William Miller, today, today, and today, till he comes. Red-faced and panting from his wild ride on his father's fastest horse, the young man rapped smartly on the back door of the Miller home. William Miller flung open the door to his nephew, Irving Gulliford, his sister's son. "Why, Irv," exclaimed Miller in alarm, "whatever are you doing here so early in the morning? Is something wrong? How are your parents?" "Why would Irving be here so early?" "Oh, no, Uncle William," the boy eagerly replied. "Everything's just fine. But Father sent me with a message, and oh, Uncle William, he let me ride his new horse. Is he ever fast? Man, we flew like the wind." "Irv," Miller said sternly, still a little apprehensive, "what's the message?" "Oh, sorry," Irving apologized. "There's no preaching in our church tomorrow, and Father wants to know if you'll come and talk to our neighbors about the prophecies you've been studying. Will you come?" Nothing could have shocked Miller more. Without a word, he stormed out of the house and hurried up the little hill into the grove of maple trees that had become his refuge. He would not do it. He could not. But after a fierce battle with God, the farmer who went into the maple grove, came out a preacher. Humbly he went home with his nephew. The following day at Dresden, 16 miles from his home, he preached his first sermon on the second advent of Christ. The eldest of 16 children, William worked hard helping his father run the farm, but his great love was reading and learning. The family owned only 3 books, a Bible, a Psalter, and a prayer book, books that young William read over and over. But the time came when he wanted more, so he went about borrowing books from anybody in the neighborhood who had them. He had an insatiable curiosity to learn. William Miller, just as Abraham Lincoln did many years later, stayed up after the family had gone to bed, then read into the wee hours of the morning. Candles were too expensive to waste for such a frivolity as reading long into the night, but there were plenty of pine knots, and all he had to do was gather them from the woods. So it was that William formed the habit of burning pine knots, as they were called locally, in the fireplace for his nightly reading light. His highest priority was being sure that there were plenty of pine knots on hand for his excursions into the world of learning. Always on the lookout for pine stumps that would make good light, he brought them into the woodlot and chopped them into their right size and shape that best suited his nightly reading requirements. He even commandeered a special hideaway where he stored the chunks of pine. When William was a little older, his pine knots caused a commotion late one night. His father, also named William, felt that his son's late-night reading would cut into his energy and efficiency for the next day's work, and the farm required every ounce of work he could get from his son. He insisted that William retire for the night when the rest of the family did. And for all that his father knew, the growing boy slept soundly through the night, the same as everyone else. William's secret life continued for some time. Night after night he read as long as he dared, then made his way back upstairs, avoiding the step that squeaked, and slept until it was time to do the morning chores. But one night he got something he hadn't bargained for. His father awoke and saw a glow downstairs. Thinking the house was on fire, he came rushing down the stairs to save his home and family from going up in flames. But instead of a house fire, he saw his son William lying peacefully before the fireplace, reading some book he'd borrowed from a neighbor. His father grabbed his horsewhip and took his son for a little chase around the room, using words that William remembered well for quite some time. "Young man, if you don't get to bed right now, I'm gonna horsewhip you." William went up to bed, at least for this night. He was only trying to get an education, a broader education than he could get from the teachers who came to their community during the first 3 or 4 months of winter, taught a few classes, and moved on. It was this self-education that earned young Miller the distinction of being the community's scribbler general. And what is a scribbler general? Most of the people in that area were not very well educated, and a young man who wanted to say something special to a young lady usually didn't have the right words at his command to impress her. So these young suitors would come to Miller, describe the young lady they wanted to know better, and William would write flowery words and phrases that would make her heart go pitter-patter. The suitor would pass the note or poem along to the damsel of his choice as his own creation, and sometimes the fair heart was won. Lucy, his love. Growing up in isolated Lowhampton was a lonely experience. Eventually, William found a summer job in Pulteney, Vermont, a few miles from Lowhampton. There he met Miss Lucy Smith, and from that time on, he often found excuses to visit Pulteney. Miss Smith returned the romantic interest and became his bride. They soon moved to her hometown, and wonder of wonders, Pulteney had a library. It was the first village in Vermont to have a free public library, and William often could be found down there reading to his heart's content. Lucy knew she'd married a farm boy, and she thought that the more he read, the more refined he would become and better husband and father he would be. She encouraged her sweetheart to go to the library as often as possible. Unfortunately, it seems to be this library that introduced William to the writings of Voltaire, David Hume, Thomas Paine, and Ethan Allen, all considered great deist writers. He turned his back on religion and began to subscribe to the philosophy of deism. Deists believed that God created the universe according to certain laws of cause and effect, but some people in this world set it in motion, then took no further interest in it. William began to meet with a group of deists in Pulteney. His doubts about the Bible grew more and more serious until he finally concluded that the Bible was only the work of designing men, and I discarded it accordingly. He remained a deist for 12 years. In spite of following deist views, William Miller was a man of high principles, fair-minded and just. His neighbors and friends liked and trusted him. He became quite involved in politics, joining the Masons and becoming an active Democrat. Year after year, he was elected to local offices such as Justice of the Peace, Constable, and Deputy Sheriff. An up-and-coming young man, he was on his way to being one of the most prominent citizens of Pulteney. In 1987, more than 1,000 documents, all in William Miller's own handwriting, were recovered from a barrel in the attic of his home in Lowhampton. Dating from the time Miller was a Justice of the Peace, the papers range from loans and repayments of loans, tax collection slips, and orders for arrest to anything else that a Justice of the Peace might be called upon to adjudicate. They lay entombed in a barrel for 150 years or so, with no one being aware of the precious cache of history. War and love. Things were looking up for William and Lucy Miller, even though he'd given up his interest in religion. Then their world changed. The War of 1812 loomed large on the horizon, and while Miller had no interest in religion, he still had a strong sense of patriotism, duty, and honor. Naturally, when the President of the United States called for men to defend the honor of the United States, William, just as his father had done during the Revolutionary War, volunteered. And now we see just how highly the Pulteney community valued William. One of his duties was to collect taxes. He must have been a fair and reasonable collector, because when word came from the President that volunteers were needed to defend the United States, 47 men in Pulteney said they would go on one condition. That condition was that William Miller, local tax collector, census taker, deputy sheriff, and all the other things he was, be appointed their officer. The original roster of those 47 men who signed their names to go to war with Captain William Miller now hangs in the William Miller home in Lowhampton, New York. Before William left Lucy and home to go to war, the two of them agreed to write to each other at least once a week. But Lucy wasn't quite the faithful letter writer that her husband thought she should be. Far from home, up near the Canadian border, he didn't hear from Lucy as often as he'd have liked, and so he wrote her this letter. Dear Lucy, have you departed this life, or are you so engaged that you cannot devote 1 hour in a week to your humble servant? The following are the words you wrote to me, not long since, to wit, if I am alive, I shall write to you weekly and put a letter in the post office every Monday morning. Ever since Wednesday noon, I have been dressed in mourning. Shall I ever see my Lucy again? I have often exclaimed, "Ah, no, she could not tell me a falsehood. She must be dead. What can I write if she's gone? I cannot write anything. She cannot hear me. I can only write to my children, into whose hands I hope this letter will fall. Dear children, you have lost your mother, and in but a little while your father must follow. Perhaps before you receive this, he will be no more. Prepare then, my children, to meet the frowns of fortune, and learn in your youth to repel the shafts of adversity. If Lucy is no more, or if she has forgotten William Miller, then this letter is directed to William S. Miller, his oldest son." Apparently, this note was sufficient to get the ink on Lucy's pen flowing again.
Yeah. You think?
A captain in the United States Army, William was at the Battle of Plattsburgh when a shell exploded within 2 feet of him and 3 other men. The others sustained injuries, but Miller walked away unscathed. At that notable moment, with the battle still raging, he didn't have time to wax philosophical. But that cannonball incident kept coming back to him, and he eventually realized that the God of heaven had protected him from harm. The gift of reconciliation. Not only had Miller been given the gift of a bright, inquiring mind, but he also seemed to have had the gift of reconciliation. He had a wonderful ability to persuade people to put aside their differences and work side by side. 2 men in his regiment had grown up in the same area and had been the best of friends. During the war, they'd remained friends and looked out for each other. Some time later, the 2 soldiers moved up near the Canadian border, probably near each other, and a major disagreement destroyed their friendship. Knowing how close they'd been, and how unhappy they were to be enemies, possibly it was their families who suggested that they go see Captain Miller and ask him to be their mediator. After all, they both held him in high regard. Somewhere down deep in their souls, they must have wanted to be friends again, for they agreed to this plan. Having no other mode of transportation, the 2 former friends walked all the way to Miller's farm to ask him to help settle their differences. So sharp was their disagreement that rather than make the journey together, they actually went by separate routes, each traveling alone with only his hostile thoughts for company. Of course, Captain Miller was glad to see them, but sorry they'd become such bitter enemies. As he listened to each of their stories, the God he didn't acknowledge gave him the wisdom to prevail in their common sense and fairness. After spending a few days at the Miller farm and undoubtedly having several conversations with the good captain, the 2 traveled home together, once again good friends. On another occasion, when one of the local political parties asked permission to hold its 4th of July picnic on Miller's property, he persuaded the committee to invite the other political party to join in the fun too. So the day of picnicking on Miller's farm became a holiday celebration rather than a political one. He apparently had another gift, that of mimicking others in both voice and mannerisms. He used this gift to the considerable amusement of his friends, and at the expense of several clergymen of his acquaintance, including his grandfather Phelps and his uncle Elihu. It's quite likely that his mischief wasn't limited to the clergy, and it does show that even though he was studious and serious, he had a wide streak of humor. It's not quite the picture we usually have of William Miller. The sermon that changed Miller's life. After the death of Miller's father, William and Lucy moved back to Lohampton so he could be near his mother and take care of her. While his years in the war had caused him to begin questioning the teachings of deism, he still didn't believe in a God who was personally interested in each of his created beings. A devout Christian, his mother went to church every week. To please her, William sometimes attended church too. After all, a deist went to church so he could be seen as honorable and upstanding in the community, and Miller wanted his wife and children in church. It was the proper thing to do. Besides, he didn't mind listening to Uncle Elihu preach on Sundays. But when Uncle Elihu was called away to preach in one of his other churches, the deacons had to take turns reading the sermons from a book. The deacons weren't very well educated and didn't read very well, and Miller found it rather tedious to listen to them. When he knew his uncle was going to be absent from the pulpit, William didn't go to church with his mother. One Sunday she asked him why he wasn't going, and he explained that it was a real chore for him to listen to the stumbling attempts of some of the men who were asked to read. He said that if he could read the sermons, then he would certainly be there. Of course, Mrs. Miller did what any self-respecting mother would do under those circumstances. She let the Board of Deacons know that her son William would be willing to read the sermons on the days the preacher was absent. The deacons were delighted. It was a chore for them too. From then on, when Uncle Elihu was in another of his churches, his deacons selected the Sunday sermon, and William Miller was pleased to read it. Things continued in this way for quite some time, Miller still holding his deist views, and, although somewhat uncomfortably, reading the sermons on Sunday. He still considered scriptures just the writings of men. On September 15, 1816, the deacons chose the reading titled Importance of Parental Duties, a sermon written by Alexander Proudfit, but as Mr. Miller read it aloud, he suddenly broke down weeping, so overcome with emotion that he couldn't continue. He was forced to hand over the reading to one of those unlearned deacons and take his seat in the congregation. In this sermon, Mr. Proudfit speaks of the way we should discipline children. He speaks about the fact that if we want our children to believe in God, we must believe. If we want them to believe in the value of prayer, we ourselves must believe in prayer. If we want them to get anything out of the worship service, we must go there expecting to get something out of it ourselves, and not just be there in body only. It was probably on this point that the Holy Spirit was able to reach William Miller. God knew that he didn't believe in prayer, even though he sat through prayers at his home and church. He knew that he didn't believe there was any value in going to church, and yet